Have you ever stood in front of a mirror, late at night, staring into your own tired eyes and wondered, what am I really doing with my life? Maybe you've chased promotions, built businesses, collected accolades, or filled your home with things you once thought would make you happy. And yet here you are, feeling an emptiness you can't quite explain. It's a strange thing about success. We're taught to crave it before we even understand what it means. From the moment we're old enough to walk, we're encouraged to win, to outshine, to rise above. Our schools reward the top of the class. Our society celebrates the rich, the famous, the powerful. And our screens, those ever-glowing rectangles in our pockets, bombard us with images of people who seem to have it all. But what if I told you, most of what we call success is an illusion, a shimmering mirage in the desert of our own desires? Let me tell you a story. There was once a man named David. On paper, David was the kind of person others envied. CEO of a fast-growing tech company, a 7-figure bank account, a penthouse view of the city skyline. His name appeared in magazines. His face smiled down from billboards. And yet, at night, alone in his luxury apartment, David would sit on the edge of his designer couch and feel a loneliness so sharp it cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. The applause, the trophies, the deals, none of it quieted the storm inside him. One evening, after another exhausting day of chasing bigger numbers, David took a long drive to the countryside. No destination, just miles of road and silence. At some point, he pulled over by an old monastery he remembered from his childhood. Drawn by a strange sense of calm, he stepped inside. An elderly monk greeted him. No titles, no questions about net worth, just a warm smile and a simple question. What burden have you been carrying? David, for the first time in years, felt his defenses crumble. And in the quiet of that ancient hall, he realized he'd spent his entire life chasing a version of success someone else had written for him. You see, the world paints success as a finish line, a shining trophy you clutch in your hands, a badge that says you made it. But what Buddhism teaches is that this kind of success is fleeting. It's like trying to catch the wind in your fist. We hunger for wealth, but the more we earn, the more anxious we become about losing it. We crave fame, yet the applause fades as quickly as it comes. We chase relationships, titles, experiences, only to find that none of them can fill the quiet ache within. Buddhism calls this the trap of attachment. The Buddha spoke of it over 2,500 years ago. Our suffering isn't born from the things of the world themselves, but from our clinging to them, from our belief that our worth is tied to what we achieve, own, or control. There's a reason even emperors with entire kingdoms at their feet sought the wisdom of monks. Because at some point, every soul faces a truth it can no longer ignore. External success, no matter how grand, can never substitute for internal peace. But don't get me wrong, Buddhism isn't against success. It's not a religion of poverty or rejection of material life. What it questions is how we define success, and at what cost we pursue it. Real success, as the ancient texts whisper, isn't about accumulating, but about liberating. Freeing oneself from the endless hunger for more. Learning to walk through the world gracefully, enjoying its offerings without being enslaved by them. Think about this. A lotus grows in the mud, yet its petals remain untouched by the dirt. It rises above, unstained and serene. That's the kind of success the Buddha pointed to, not being above the world, but rising through it without losing your essence. So what are we really chasing when we say we want to be successful? Is it admiration, security, validation? Or is it something quieter, something harder to name, like a longing to feel whole, to belong, to know peace even in chaos? The truth is, most of us are running a race with no finish line, pursuing milestones that move every time we get closer. And in that endless chase, we miss the beauty of where we are and who we are becoming. I'm inviting you now in this very moment to pause, not for me, not for the world, but for yourself. Take a breath. Feel the air move through your chest. Listen to the silent hum of life around you. In this stillness, you might sense what the sages knew, that success isn't out there, waiting to be conquered. It's already here within you, beneath the noise, behind the wanting, beyond the labels. It's the quiet knowing that you are enough. And from this place of stillness, we can begin to reimagine what success truly means. Because there's a kind of success that doesn't rust, fade, or vanish with the next market crash or broken promise. It's a success no one can steal, no circumstance can erode. It lives in the clarity of your mind, the compassion in your heart, and the peace in your spirit. And the path to that kind of success, one that rises above fleeting applause, begins when you're ready to stop chasing and start seeing. The world may still measure success in numbers, likes, followers, and fortunes. But you can choose a different scale. And in that choice, you might discover something far greater than the world ever promised. Shall we walk a little further down this path together? So, if the success we've been chasing is an illusion, then what does real success look like? What does it mean to truly succeed, not in the eyes of society, but in the quiet chambers of your own heart? This is where the wisdom of the Buddha offers something both ancient and astonishingly modern. In the West, success is often measured by what you accumulate. In Buddhism, it's measured by what you can let go. Let me say that again. In Buddhism, success is not about gaining more, but about needing less. Now, this doesn't mean you have to give away your home, quit your job, or renounce every comfort to sit cross-legged under a tree. What it means is this. The things you own, the titles you hold, the experiences you chase, they're not the problem. The problem is your attachment to them. You see, the Buddha understood something profound about human nature. He saw that much of our suffering doesn't come from what happens to us, but from how we cling to what we think should happen. We want life to go our way. We want people to behave as we expect. We want to win, to be admired, to feel secure. And when reality refuses to match our script, we suffer. In the Dhammapada, one of the earliest collections of the Buddha's teachings, it's written, "From craving springs grief, from craving springs fear. For him who is wholly free from craving, there is no grief whence fear." It's craving, not money, not relationships, not possessions, but the craving, the grasping, the desperate wanting that chains us to suffering. So what's the alternative? The Buddha pointed to a success that isn't fragile because it doesn't rely on conditions outside of you. It's the success of a mind at ease, a heart free from constant comparison, a spirit content not because it has everything, but because it no longer needs everything. Imagine this for a moment. Two people sit by a river. One obsesses over catching the biggest fish, growing frustrated each time a small one bites. The other simply watches the water, marveling at the way sunlight dances on the ripples, content whether the fish come or not. Who do you think leaves the river richer that day? Buddhism invites us to become the second person, to participate fully in life's flow, to work, to love, to create, but without being enslaved by the outcomes. In fact, the Buddha laid out a very clear guide to redefining success through what's known as the four immeasurables. Loving kindness, metta. Success is found in your ability to wish happiness for others without envy or expectation. Compassion, karuna. Success is found in the softness of your heart, even when the world turns harsh. Sympathetic joy, mudita. Success is found when you can celebrate the joy of others as if it were your own. Equanimity, upekkha. And perhaps most importantly, success is found in your capacity to remain balanced amidst life's highs and lows. Imagine measuring your life not by the size of your house, but by the size of your heart. Not by the length of your resume, but by the depth of your peace. There's a famous parable in Buddhist tradition about a wealthy merchant who asked a monk, "Master, what is the secret to a joyful life?" The monk simply replied, "Want less." It wasn't a rejection of life's pleasures. It was a reminder that true joy doesn't depend on having, but on being. And here's the paradox: the less you cling, the more freely you live. The more you release your tight grip on how things should be, the more beauty you find in how things are. It's not about passivity. It's about wisdom. The wisdom to see that some things are beyond your control, and your peace depends not on changing the world, but on changing how you meet the world. So perhaps success isn't the trophy you raise, but the weight you lay down. Not the applause you gather, but the silence you learn to savor. Not the heights you climb, but the depth you're willing to reach within yourself. And the beautiful thing is, this kind of success isn't reserved for monks in distant monasteries. It's accessible to you, right here, right now. In your next conversation, in the way you treat a stranger, in how gently you speak to yourself, in the quiet moments between your victories and your failures. The Buddha taught that a single drop of water over time can fill an entire vessel. In the same way, each small act of awareness, each moment of compassion, each choice to let go, reshapes your definition of success. So as we move forward, ask yourself, what am I really chasing? And more importantly, who would I be if I stopped? Because in that space, between craving and contentment, is where a different kind of success begins. The kind that no one can give you, the kind no one can take away. And that is the kind worth chasing. When people chase after success, what are they really chasing? Is it money, fame, power? Or is it something deeper, a sense of worth, of peace, of knowing that their life matters? The Buddha saw clearly that what we call success in this world is often a restless pursuit. A game where even when you win, you lose. Because the satisfaction is fleeting, the applause fades, and the emptiness returns. That's why he didn't just dismiss success. He redefined it. He offered a different kind of wealth, one untouched by market crashes or public opinion. A success not built on what you possess, but on how you live. And at the heart of this teaching is the Eightfold Path, a simple yet profound guide to a life of genuine peace and fulfillment. It begins with right view. Before you can walk a different road, you must first see where you are. Most of us believe that lasting happiness lies somewhere outside ourselves, in the next achievement, the next relationship, the next purchase. But the Buddha taught that clinging to what is impermanent guarantees suffering. Everything we hold dear will one day fade. Success, if it's built on things destined to slip through our fingers, will never satisfy for long. Right view is the wisdom of seeing life as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. From that clarity comes right intention, the silent vow within the heart. Once we see the futility of chasing external things, we begin to ask, what do I really want from this life? Not in terms of titles or possessions, but in the kind of person I wish to become. The Buddha encouraged us to cultivate intentions of kindness, compassion, and renunciation of harmful desires. It is the moment you stop asking, what can I take? And start asking, what can I give? How can I cause less harm in this world? Words, too, carry immense power, which is why right speech is essential. Success is not only about what you build, but what you destroy along the way. And often, it is careless words that inflict the deepest wounds. The Buddha urged us to avoid lying, gossiping, speaking harshly, or indulging in idle chatter. Instead, we are asked to speak words that are truthful, kind, and helpful. Imagine the legacy of a life where every conversation uplifts rather than tears down. Such a person radiates a quiet authority, a success that no position can grant. But thoughts and words must translate into deeds. Right action reminds us that it is not enough to think noble thoughts while living in ways that harm others. A truly successful life is one where your behavior reflects your values. It means refraining from taking life, from stealing, from exploiting others for personal gain. The Buddha wasn't interested in hollow virtue. He spoke of an integrity that runs deep, where every choice becomes a stepping stone toward peace. This naturally extends to how we make our living. Right livelihood asks us to choose work that does not harm, that uplifts rather than corrupts. In a world where success is often defined by how much you can extract from others, this teaching is radical. It says that no amount of wealth is worth the price of your conscience. That true success is measured not just by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. Of course, walking this path requires effort, but not the frenzied striving the world celebrates. Right effort is about steady, mindful persistence. It means abandoning unwholesome states of mind like greed and anger, and cultivating wholesome qualities like generosity, patience, and compassion. It is the kind of effort that doesn't burn you out but quietly strengthens you, like the steady flame of a lamp in the wind. To walk such a path demands presence. Right mindfulness is the art of truly being where you are. Most people race through life, lost in regrets of the past and anxieties about the future. The Buddha taught us to come home to this moment, to eat when we eat, walk when we walk, to breathe fully and notice the rise and fall of each passing thought without becoming entangled in it. Because a life of success isn't built on years, it is built on moments, and only mindfulness allows you to truly live them. And finally, right concentration, the ability to steady the mind amidst the noise. In a culture addicted to distraction, concentration is a lost art. Yet it is through sustained attention, whether in meditation or in our daily work, that clarity arises. The Buddha described this as the practice of gathering the scattered threads of the mind into a single, steady current. It's not about escaping the world, but engaging it from a place of depth and stillness. And so, the Eightfold Path is not a ladder to climb towards some future success, but a circle you live here and now. Each step nourishing the others, each act of clarity, kindness, and wisdom deepening your peace. In walking this path, you slowly free yourself from the tyranny of craving and discover a success the world cannot give or take away. A success found not in applause but in the quiet joy of a heart at ease. That, the Buddha would say, is the only success that was ever worth pursuing. If you've ever held a handful of water, you'll know this. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips through your fingers. Life, success, relationships, they are much the same. The world tells us to hold on tightly, to cling to what we've achieved, to grasp at what we desire, to fear losing what we have. And yet, the Buddha taught that the secret to a peaceful, successful life is found not in attachment, but in letting go. To many, this sounds like a contradiction. How can you be ambitious, work hard, and still practice non-attachment? Doesn't letting go mean giving up? The truth is, it's quite the opposite. The Buddha understood that the source of our deepest suffering is not the things we chase, but the way we cling to them. It's not wealth that hurts us, but the desperate need to keep it. Not love that wounds us, but the possessiveness we wrap around it. Not success itself, but the fear of failure that tightens its grip on our hearts. Non-attachment is not indifference. It isn't apathy or withdrawal from life. It's the art of holding things lightly, of fully engaging with the world, giving your best, caring deeply, but without letting your happiness depend on the outcome. Imagine a musician playing a beautiful melody. If they obsess over whether the audience applauds, they'll tense up, stumble, and lose the joy of the music. But if they pour their heart into the performance for its own sake, they enter a state of flow, where creation itself becomes the reward. That is non-attachment. The Buddha often compared this to holding a flower. You admire its color, breathe in its fragrance, delight in its presence, but you do not cling. You know it will wither, as all things do. And so, you cherish it in this moment without grasping, without fearing its departure. This, too, is how we must hold our success. In one of his teachings, the Buddha spoke of the concept of upadana, the clinging, the grasping that ties us to suffering. He taught that we suffer not because things change, but because we refuse to accept their impermanence. We build palaces of identity around our careers, our titles, our possessions, and when life inevitably shifts, as it always does, we feel shattered. The wise learn to see this, to live fully, to love sincerely, to work passionately, but to release the craving for permanence. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you care so deeply that you can let life be what it is without needing to control it. This mindset transforms the way you approach success. You work not to prove your worth, but to express it. You pursue excellence not to defeat others, but to discover your own potential. You build wealth not to own the world but to share its blessings. And when losses come, as they will, you bow to them with grace, knowing nothing real can be lost. Non-attachment also liberates you from envy and comparison. In the clinging mind, someone else's success feels like a threat. But the mind that practices letting go understands their light does not diminish yours. The sun and the moon both shine without conflict. When you stop clinging, you start celebrating for others, for yourself, for life itself. Perhaps the most profound gift of non-attachment is that it roots your happiness not in external conditions, but in the steady, quiet center of your own being. When storms come, you are not swept away. When fortunes rise or fall, your peace remains. Because you have realized the truth the Buddha pointed to: all things arise, all things pass away. And in releasing your grip on the temporary, you touch the eternal. The great Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once said, "Everything is perfect as it is, and yet there is always room for improvement." This paradox captures the spirit of non-attachment. You can strive, you can dream, you can build, but you do so from a place of peace, not desperation. And in that space, a new kind of success is born. One not defined by the world's applause, but by the lightness of your own heart. One that stays with you, not because you clench your fists around it, but because you've learned to open your hands. This, the Buddha would say, is the way of one who walks awake in a world of sleepers. Close your eyes for a moment and ask yourself, when was the last time you were truly here in this moment? Not thinking about your next meeting, not replaying yesterday's regrets, but fully alive, fully present, exactly where you are. For most people, life isn't lived in the now. It's spent either chasing the future or clinging to the past. And in that endless race, we lose the one thing we truly possess: this breath, this heartbeat, this instant. The Buddha understood this, and so he gave the world a priceless gift: mindfulness. Mindfulness isn't a trendy buzzword or a wellness fad. It is an ancient, profound practice that lies at the very heart of Buddhism. In its simplest form, mindfulness means paying full attention to the present moment, without judgment, without distraction. It is the art of coming home to yourself. But what does this have to do with success? Everything. You see, most of our failures in work, in relationships, in personal growth, don't happen because we lack talent or opportunity. They happen because we're absent. Our bodies move through the world, but our minds are scattered, restless, anxious. In this state, we make poor decisions. We miss opportunities. We damage connections. We react instead of respond. The Buddha taught that mindfulness is like a lamp in a dark room. It illuminates what's truly happening, both around us and within us. When you are mindful, you begin to notice the thoughts that sabotage you, the habits that drain you, the fears that control you. And in seeing them clearly, you gain the power to change them. This is where meditation enters. Meditation is the training ground for mindfulness. It's where you learn to sit with yourself, to observe the mind's endless chatter without getting caught in it. At first, it feels almost impossible. The mind resists, throwing up distractions, discomfort, doubts. But if you stay, if you watch, something remarkable happens. You realize you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. This simple, astonishing truth reshapes everything. The business setback is no longer a personal failure, but a passing event. The harsh criticism no longer defines you, but becomes a lesson. The anxiety about the future softens, because you've anchored yourself in the steady ground of the present. In ancient Buddhist texts, the Buddha likened an untrained mind to a wild elephant, powerful, but dangerous when uncontrolled. Meditation tames this elephant. It turns that raw, restless energy into focused clarity. And in a world that celebrates hustle over wisdom, this clarity becomes your superpower. When you meditate regularly, you start making decisions not from impulse, but from insight. You catch yourself before reacting in anger. You notice when you're being driven by fear rather than purpose. You listen more, rush less, and see opportunities where others see problems. Great leaders throughout history, from emperors to entrepreneurs, have understood the value of stillness, not as laziness but as mastery. In the stillness of meditation, you meet yourself. You confront your illusions. You shed the noise of the world and you hear the quiet truth beneath it. And here's the secret. True success isn't created by doing more, but by seeing more clearly. When your mind is clear, when your awareness is sharp, you no longer waste energy chasing things that don't matter. You align your actions with your deepest values. You choose projects, people, and paths that nourish you rather than drain you. Mindfulness and meditation don't make life's challenges disappear, but they transform the way you meet them. Where once you would have panicked, you breathe. Where once you would have blamed, you reflect. Where once you would have clung, you let go. And over time, this changes not just your inner world, but your outer one. Success stops being a frantic climb and becomes a steady, graceful unfolding. You find yourself achieving more, not because you're forcing it, but because you've removed the inner obstacles that once held you back. You stop chasing happiness in distant places and discover it quietly blooming in the ordinary moments of your day. A sip of tea, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, a task completed with care, a kind word exchanged. These too are victories. The Buddha taught that mindfulness is the path to the deathless, to a life untouched by the endless cycle of craving and disappointment. And while the world around you may remain chaotic, you carry within you an unshakable calm, a clarity that no success or failure can take from you. This is the invisible advantage of those who walk the path of mindfulness. Their success is not an accident, but the natural fruit of a well-tended mind. So tonight, before you sleep, take 1 minute. Sit quietly, follow your breath. Notice where your mind wanders, and gently, without judgment, bring it back. Do this daily, and you'll find that you're no longer just chasing success, you're becoming it. Have you ever noticed how difficult it can be to feel genuinely happy for someone else's success? A friend lands a dream job. A colleague gets a promotion you secretly wanted. A stranger online shares a picture-perfect life while you quietly wonder, why not me? It's a feeling we rarely talk about, but it sits heavy in the heart. Envy, comparison, quiet resentment, emotions that rob us of peace, and ironically, of our own path to success. But long before modern psychology spoke about the dangers of comparison culture, the Buddha offered a profound antidote: mudita. Mudita is a Sanskrit and Pali word that means sympathetic joy or delight in the happiness and success of others. It is one of the 4 immeasurables in Buddhist practice, along with loving kindness, compassion, and equanimity, and perhaps the most overlooked in our modern, competitive world. You see, in a society wired for rivalry, we're trained to view another's success as a threat to our own. Subtly, we believe there's only so much happiness, wealth, or recognition to go around. If they have more, it must mean we have less. But Buddhism teaches otherwise. The Buddha likened mudita to a candle lighting another candle. One flame doesn't lose its light by kindling another. Instead, the room grows brighter. In the same way, rejoicing in the fortune of others does not diminish your own, it expands your heart. Why does this matter for success? Because the bitterness of comparison is poison to the mind. It narrows your perspective, drains your energy, and fills your days with quiet dissatisfaction. The mind obsessed with envy is a restless mind, and a restless mind struggles to achieve anything meaningful. Mudita frees you from this trap. When you cultivate mudita, you shift from a scarcity mindset to one of abundance. You realize the world's success isn't a zero-sum game, that your friend's promotion doesn't block your future, that the stranger's perfect vacation doesn't steal your joy. Instead, you begin to experience a lightness in the heart, a natural gladness that rises unforced when you hear good news. It may feel unfamiliar at first. Decades of conditioning have trained you to compare, to measure, to subtly compete. But the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. Imagine waking up each day no longer weighed down by quiet envy. Imagine being able to hear of others' achievements, their new business, their blossoming love, their unexpected windfall, and feel only gladness. Not because it affects you, but because joy in any form is worth celebrating. This isn't just sentimental wisdom, it's strategic. A mind unburdened by envy is sharper, freer, more creative. When you stop wasting energy resenting others, you redirect that energy into your own growth. You begin to move through the world with less tension, forging relationships based on sincerity, not silent rivalry. And here's the secret the Buddha knew. The person who rejoices in the success of others inevitably attracts success of their own. Why? Because people gravitate towards those who uplift, who celebrate without jealousy, who radiate authentic kindness. Opportunities come not just from skill, but from the hearts you touch. In a culture that often rewards cutthroat ambition, mudita makes you unforgettable. But mudita isn't naive. It doesn't mean ignoring injustice or pretending life is fair. It means recognizing that joy multiplies when shared, that another's fortune need not be your misfortune, and that true success is measured not just by what you achieve, but by the generosity of your spirit. In Buddhist monasteries, monks begin their days with chants wishing happiness for all beings, including those they envy, those who have wronged them, even those more fortunate. It's not an empty ritual, but a deliberate training of the heart, because they understand, a heart small with envy will never hold the vastness of true peace, and neither will yours. So the next time you hear good news about someone else, pause. Notice the first stirrings of comparison, of longing, of judgment. Then deliberately choose to celebrate. Say silently, "May their success continue. May their happiness grow." It may feel awkward at first, but slowly you'll notice a change. The knot in your chest loosens, the resentment fades, and in its place blooms a quiet joy not just for them but for yourself. Because every time you rejoice in another's happiness, you train your heart to recognize happiness in all its forms. And a heart that recognizes happiness easily attracts more of it. This, the Buddha taught, is one of life's greatest, quietest victories. And so perhaps real success isn't a race to the top, but a widening of the heart. And so, dear listener, we arrive at the end of this journey together. But perhaps it's not an ending at all. Because if there's one truth Buddhism teaches about success, it's this: there is no final finish line. In the worldly sense, success is always a moving target. Today's promotion fades into tomorrow's pressure. The applause you chased grows silent. The wealth you built demands maintenance. Even the titles you earn will one day be forgotten. But the Buddha's wisdom points us somewhere deeper. Real success is not a destination. It's not a trophy you clutch. It's not a peak you conquer. It is a way of being. It's in how lightly you walk through the world, unburdened by the hunger for endless achievement. It's in the quiet strength of a heart content, yet still open to growth. It's in your ability to lift others as you rise, to rejoice in their joy, to find meaning not in what you gain, but in how you live. True success, the Buddha taught, is the mastery of the mind. It's awakening to the fact that external victories are fleeting, while inner peace endures. It's learning to hold wealth without clinging to it, to enjoy praise without being trapped by it, and to face loss without collapsing beneath it. It's choosing compassion over competition, mindfulness over mindless ambition, presence over possession. It's walking the Eightfold Path not as a checklist, but as a daily commitment to wisdom, ethical living, and mental clarity. And it's remembering, every day you wake up breathing, you have already succeeded at the most precious thing of all, being alive in this fleeting, fragile, miraculous human life. So as you leave this video, I invite you to pause. Take a long, steady breath. Feel the weight you've been carrying, the expectations, the comparisons, the old definitions of success, and, if you're willing, let them drop. Redefine what it means to make it in this world. Not by how much you gather, but by how much light you bring. Not by the speed of your rise, but by the depth of your presence. Not by the scale of your wins, but by the peace in your heart when no one's watching. And remember, every step you take mindfully, Every moment you choose wisdom over impulse is a quiet act of success. Thank you for walking this path with me today. If this message spoke to something in you, if it helped you see success through a gentler, wiser lens, I invite you to join this growing community. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today. Your small act of kindness could be the wisdom someone else has been waiting for. Until our next journey together, may you be well, may you be peaceful, and may your heart know the quiet joy of a life well lived. Namo Buddhaya.